loyalty and controlled family decisions, but this time it became the place where loyalty met consequence. Camilla sat
यार
across from
वो
him, expecting reassurance,
स्ट्रीमिंग स्टार्ट की थी
perhaps
उन्हें तो
even
सेटिंग पे
protection.
क्लिक करा
Instead, she watched the
हाँ
king place his
एक
hand
चुप क्या
over
मेरे
the
को हेड
sealed
हेड पे
royal
क्लिक
order,
करे
a formal written decision carrying the authority of the crown.
स्ट्रीम
And she
दीवार
saw the truth before he said it aloud. Charles opened the file slowly, but his voice did not shake. He confirmed that
तो ये
Camilla would
ऑप्शन
no longer hold a central decision-making role in future royal planning, public ceremonial
पेरेंट्स थे
leadership,
वरना ये जनरल
or
थे नहीं
private
होते
family succession matters. Royal
ठीक है
planning
छोड़
meant the
जनरल थे वरना
long-term
जनरल था
choices shaping duties, appearances, and
तो गो ना
influence within the monarchy, while succession
कहीं
matters
गो ना
touched
कोई
the future path of the
स्क्रॉल
crown
करते रहो
itself.
ये
The
तो नहीं
words landed with brutal force.
ये भी नहीं
Camilla did not interrupt him. She did not plead. She simply stared at the page as if the ink had taken something living from her. Camilla had imagined many enemies over the years, but she had
चलो
not
चलो स्टूडियो
prepared
मोड
for
ही
this
देखा
kind of
स्टूडियो मोड
wound from Charles. The queen consort had stood beside him through storms that would have broken weaker alliances, and now he was the one drawing the boundary around her future. Charles felt the pain of it immediately. He was not speaking like a husband. He was speaking like a monarch who had decided the crown
कौन
could
है
not
यार नहीं
afford
समझ में
another
नहीं चाहिए वो
shadow over its next chapter. Silence swallowed the room after Charles finished. Aides waiting beyond the door noticed that no voices followed.
तो
No
हाइट की लगी
chairs
थे
moved, no papers were shuffled. Minutes passed with a strange stillness, the kind that tells a palace when history has shifted without needing a bell to announce it. Camilla's hand remained on the table, unmoving, close enough to the file to touch it,
अच्छा
but
भाई
too
मैं चल रहा
stunned to
हूँ ना
do
वाला
so.
व्यू
In
स्टूडियो
that
अपने को
moment,
देखने
she understood this was not a warning, it was not a test. It was not an opening for negotiation, it was final.
ऐड तो ऑन कर
Charles
चाहे
looked
देखो
at her, and the sadness in his face made the decision feel even colder.
खोल ना एडिट कर रही
Camilla
एडिट
had
कर
wanted him to soften, to add one sentence that would give her hope, but he offered
क्लिक हूँ
none.
क्लिक हूँ
The
क्लिक
royal
क्यों करना
future
था
had been redrawn, and her place inside it had been narrowed with calm, devastating precision. Yet the most frightening part was not what Charles had said. It was what the room itself seemed to reveal. This order had not appeared overnight. Someone had prepared it, someone had reviewed it, and someone close to the throne had known. This moment was coming long before Camilla walked through the door, and before Camilla could understand what had been taken from her.
ओके
The room itself began to reveal who had quietly prepared for her fall. The decision was not only about Camilla, it reached into every corner of the royal family, touching old wounds, private loyalties, and the future of the monarchy itself. Charles looked like a king making a sacrifice. William looked like a future monarch protecting the institution. Catherine remained composed, but her silence carried weight, and Camilla, surrounded by people who had once bowed to her position, suddenly felt every eye measuring what remained. Charles stayed at the center of it all, because only he could carry the pain and the blame. As husband, he knew what those words had done to Camilla. As king, he knew why they had to be spoken. The crown, meaning the monarchy and its future authority, was bigger than one marriage, one promise, or one private heartbreak. That was what made the moment so brutal. Charles was not choosing strangers over her. He was choosing the survival of the royal family over the comfort of the woman who had waited years to stand beside him. Camilla felt the rejection in every formal sentence. She had expected warmth from Charles,
रिस्पॉन्स है
even if
लिखा
the
वाला
decision hurt.
इरफान
Instead, the king spoke with careful official language, as if
ये
every
मीटिंग
word
कम है
had been weighed before she entered the room. That made it worse. It told her this was not a sudden emotional reaction. It had been prepared. It had been reviewed. It had been accepted by people who understood exactly how deeply it would cut. William watched the
इरफान चलो
silence
ठीक
around
है
the table and chose his words with caution. The prince understood that one sharp sentence could turn private pain into open family war. He had no desire to humiliate Camilla, but he also knew her reduced role changed everything. For years, the future of the monarchy had depended on careful balance. Now that balance was moving toward him and Catherine, and everyone in the room could feel it. Catherine remained still, but her silence was not empty. The princess noticed what others tried not to see. Camilla kept looking at Charles, waiting for him to add one softer line, one sign that the decision could be eased later. But the king never offered it. He looked sad, yes, he looked burdened, yes, but he did not take the words back, and he did not leave the door open. Camilla glanced toward the file again and saw a private note resting beside it. The note was small, but its meaning was enormous. It suggested the order had already passed through senior household officials before she ever sat down. Household officials are the trusted palace staff who help manage royal duties, schedules, and private decisions behind the scenes. That meant the room had not gathered to discuss her future. The room had gathered to deliver it. Charles lowered his eyes for a moment, and William understood the cost. Catherine understood it too. Camilla understood something darker. Her future had not been taken in one sentence. It had been shaped quietly before she was invited to hear it. And yet the real reason behind the order did not begin in this room at all. To understand why Charles could make such a painful choice, the palace had to look back to the incident no one wanted spoken aloud. Every royal crisis has a moment everyone later remembers differently. For this one, it was not a scandal in public or a headline in the morning papers. It was a ceremony behind palace doors, quiet enough to be denied, but powerful enough to alter the course of Camilla's future. On that day, a single interruption turned concern into alarm and alarm into a decision Charles could no longer avoid. Camilla entered that day, believing her place was still secure. The ceremony was called the Windsor Continuity Briefing, a private royal meeting where future roles were reviewed before senior courtiers, meaning trusted officials who guide palace planning and protect royal order. It mattered because the monarchy was already preparing for its next chapter. William and Catherine were no longer just waiting behind Charles. They were being shaped into the steady center of what would come after him. Charles listened carefully as each duty was read aloud. The king understood why the briefing mattered, because one role could create years of palace confusion. William sat with controlled patience, knowing the future monarchy needed clean lines, not quiet battles. Catherine remained calm beside him, but the princess knew her growing authority would not please everyone. Camilla knew it too, and that knowledge sat heavy between them before she spoke. Camilla finally challenged the proposal when Catherine was named lead representative for a major royal foundation ceremony. A royal foundation ceremony is a public event tied to charity and royal service, and being named lead representative means becoming the main face of that work. To outsiders it sounded like duty. Inside the room it sounded like power. The queen consort questioned why Catherine should be placed ahead of more senior experience, and the words struck harder than she expected. Charles watched Camilla with visible frustration, and the pain on his face said what he could not speak. He wanted to defend her. He wanted to believe she was only asking for fairness. But the king also saw the courtiers shift, saw William's jaw tighten, saw Catherine lower her eyes for one brief second. That tiny reaction carried enormous weight. It told Charles that the issue was no longer about one ceremony. It was about whether Camilla would accept the future that was already moving toward William and Catherine. William felt the challenge deeply. The prince did not hear it as a simple question about protocol. He heard it as resistance to the structure he would one day inherit. Catherine kept her composure, but she understood the message clearly. If her authority could be questioned in that room, it could be weakened in every room after it. Camilla had spoken once, but the damage spread quickly. A senior aide later marked the incident in a documented account prepared for Charles. The note described it as the moment personal influence crossed into constitutional risk, meaning private emotion had begun to threaten the stable order of royal authority. That phrase did not accuse Camilla of rebellion. but it warned the king that her influence could create division around the next reign. Charles read that account more than once. Each time, the same truth returned. Camilla's future could not remain undefined. William and Catherine could not build authority, while another power center challenged them from within. And so that file became the seed of the order. Camilla would later hear from Charles himself. But a file could only explain the decision. It could not prepare anyone for the confrontation that followed. Camilla did not break immediately. At first she sat still, as if dignity alone could hold the room together. Then Charles said the one word she had feared. Final. That was when the silence cracked. The queen consort looked at the king, not as a monarch, but as the man who had promised she would never again stand outside the center of his world. And for the first time, Charles had no comforting answer. Camilla waited until the formal meeting ended. She watched the others leave one by one, and then asked Charles to stay behind. No aides, no secretaries, no family members, just the two of them facing the damage that official words had created. Aides are trusted palace workers who manage royal duties and private schedules. But Camilla wanted none of them in the room now. She did not want witnesses. She wanted the man behind the crown to answer her. Charles agreed, because he knew the private conversation would hurt more than the order itself. The royal order had sounded cold because it was written to protect the monarchy. But the pain it caused was deeply personal. Camilla had spent years fighting to be accepted beside him, and now the king had confirmed that her future would be smaller, quieter, and far less powerful. That mattered because her role was not only about duties, it was about the life she believed she had finally secured. Camilla looked at Charles and asked the question he could not escape. Had the monarchy won over their marriage? The words hit him harder than anger would have. He lowered his gaze before answering, and that pause told her almost everything. Charles said the crown had not won, duty had. The crown means the monarchy itself, the long line of responsibility that must survive beyond one person's feelings. But Camilla heard only one thing. He had chosen its survival over her comfort. Charles tried to explain that protecting the future now meant limiting any role that could create division around William and Catherine. He did not say it cruelly. He said it like a man cutting into his own heart, because he believed the wound was necessary. Camilla heard William's name and stiffened. The queen consort asked whether the prince had pushed for the order, whether he had sat behind closed doors, shaping her fall before she even knew it had begun. Charles refused to place blame on William. He told Camilla the decision belonged to him and only him. The king would not let her turn pain into accusation, even though he understood why she wanted someone else to blame. Camilla pushed back again, asking whether Catherine's new authority mattered more than everything she had endured for Charles. He did not answer quickly. That silence was worse than denial. Camilla moved her chair back sharply. The sound cut through the room like a verdict. She stood, holding herself together with the last strength dignity could offer, and said she finally understood. The crown had chosen its future without her. Charles looked stricken, but he did not take back the order. He could not. The decision had already crossed the line from marriage into monarchy. Camilla turned toward the door, but her face had changed. Charles saw it. The hurt had not disappeared. It had hardened. Outside that room, William waited in silence, unaware that Camilla's next words would pull him directly into the conflict. And when the door finally opened, the pain inside did not stay private. It stepped into the corridor with them. Power inside a palace rarely announces itself. It moves through quiet signatures, revised schedules, cancelled invitations, and doors that no longer open as easily as before. Camilla had not only lost a title of influence, she had lost access to the machinery that made influence real. And behind Charles's calm decision stood a larger force. The future monarchy preparing to protect itself before another crisis could begin. Charles signed the final page with a pause that did not go unnoticed. A senior courtier stood close enough to see the hesitation before the pen touched paper, and that pause revealed more than any speech. A courtier is a trusted royal official who helps manage palace life and protect the order around the monarch. This one understood the cost immediately. The king was not simply changing Camilla's duties. He was changing the way power would move through the family. Camilla's new position was now more ceremonial and limited. Ceremonial means public duties connected to tradition, appearance, and royal support, but not real control over planning or future decisions. That mattered because influence inside the monarchy does not always come from titles. It comes from meetings, schedules, access, and the quiet ability to shape what happens before the public ever sees it. Camilla still had royal dignity, but the deeper levers were being moved beyond her reach. William felt no victory in that shift. The prince knew his future court was quietly gaining more control over long-term planning, charitable appearances, and ceremonial representation. A future court means the team and structure that will support him when he becomes king. To the outside world, that sounded like preparation. Inside the family, it felt like a warning. William understood Camilla might see his caution as betrayal, and that knowledge sat heavily on him. Catherine remained calm in public, but she understood the danger beneath the silence. The princess knew humiliation could turn sadness into resentment, and resentment inside a palace rarely stays still. Camilla had lost influence in a way that everyone would eventually notice. Catherine could accept responsibility, but she could not ignore the emotional cost. The queen consort had been wounded, and wounded people sometimes look for the person they believe benefited most. Charles knew that too. The king had insisted the decision was his. Yet the document clearly protected William and Catherine's position. One clause carried the sharpest meaning. It prevented Camilla from overruling future household plans connected to the prince, the princess, or their children. Household plans are the private arrangements that guide royal schedules, family roles, ceremonies, and appearances. That clause mattered because it drew a hard line around the next generation. Camilla would not be able to block their path, delay their rise, or reshape their place through private pressure. Charles had built a wall without calling it one. William understood why it was needed. Catherine understood why it would hurt. And somewhere beyond the closed doors, Camilla was beginning to understand that her loss was not symbolic. It was practical, it was immediate. Charles set the pen down after signing, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The senior courtier later described the moment in a documented palace account as the instant the king chose structure over sentiment. That phrase followed the file into private circulation. Quiet but explosive it proved. The decision had not been emotional. It had been strategic. The order moved from private pain to palace instruction, and the first consequences appeared almost immediately. No public statement was needed. No dramatic announcement had to be made. One altered schedule would be enough to tell Camilla exactly what her future had become. The cruelty of royal change is that it often arrives politely. No raised voice, no public disgrace, just a name removed from one briefing list. A seat shifted at one dinner, a private invitation that never arrives. For Camilla, the fallout began in small movements that struck harder than any speech. By morning, the palace routine she knew had already started reorganizing itself around her absence. Camilla received the revised schedule before breakfast, and the first page told her everything. Several future planning meetings no longer carried her name. Future planning meetings are private palace discussions where royal duties, public appearances, and family responsibilities are arranged before they reach the public. That mattered because these meetings were where influence lived. Camilla had not just been removed from a chair. She had been removed from the room where decisions began. Charles's office sent the adjustment formally, and that made the wound sharper. The king could have softened the change with a private message, But the schedule arrived through the proper channel, clean and official. That meant the order was already active. It was not a mistake. It was not a delay. It was not a temporary pause. While feeling settled, Camilla stared at the paper and understood that the palace had moved faster than her grief. Camilla sat alone with the schedule in her hand. Stunned by how quickly authority could disappear, the queen consort had spent years learning how power sounded in quiet rooms. And now she was hearing the other side of it. Power leaving, doors closing, names shifting. The paper did not accuse her. It did not insult her. That was what made it cruel. It simply showed her that life inside the monarchy could continue without asking if she was ready. Charles heard she had withdrawn to her private sitting room, and the news visibly weighed on him. The private sitting room, a personal space used away from official duty, became the first place where the cost of his decision truly settled. The king knew Camilla would read every missing meeting like a sentence against her. He also knew that if he rushed to comfort her, he might weaken the very boundary he had just created. Catherine's name appeared where Camilla had expected her own. One ceremonial appearance, once quietly linked to the queen consort, had been reassigned to the princess. A ceremonial appearance is a public royal duty tied to tradition, charity, or national service. To the public, it would look simple. To Camilla, it meant Catherine was not just rising. She was stepping into spaces Camilla had been told to leave behind. Camilla turned the page, then stopped. A trusted aide noticed her fold the revised schedule without reading the final sheet, as though another removal might break whatever strength remained. The aide said nothing. She understood the silence. Camilla did not need sympathy spoken aloud. She needed one sign that Charles still saw her pain as more than palace damage. But the king remained distant, trapped between concern and consequence. Charles carried that distance heavily. He knew Camilla's humiliation could deepen into bitterness. Yet he also knew William and Catherine needed clear authority before the next chapter began. The monarchy had chosen order over comfort, and the first sign of exile had arrived, not with thunder, but with a revised list. Camilla placed the folded paper down, and the quiet felt final. Yet, the deepest shift would not come from schedules or ceremonies. It would come from one private conversation that changed William's understanding of Charles. Because while Camilla faced the first signs of losing power, William was about to hear the cost of the decision from the only man who could explain it. Not every turning point arrives with anger. Some arrive in a room where two people speak softly because both understand the weight of what has been done. Charles and William met without aides, without papers, and without the protection of formal language. For once, there was no court between them. Only a father who had wounded his wife, and a son who knew the monarchy could not survive another divided center. Charles asked William to meet after Camilla's schedule changes became known inside the household. The household means the private royal staff and working structure that keeps duties, meetings, and family planning in order. That mattered because once the staff knew, the decision was no longer just emotional. It had become operational. People were already acting on it. Doors were already closing. Camilla was already feeling the shape of her new future. William entered carefully, and Charles did not greet him like a king preparing to defend an order. He greeted him like a father, carrying a wound he could not hide. The monarch had spent years learning how to speak through duty, but in that moment, he let the formal tone fall away. He told William that Camilla's devastation was real, not dramatic, not political, real. The prince listened with visible discomfort because he had feared the decision would hurt her, but he had not wanted it to break her. Charles admitted the cost had been personal. He said he had delayed the order 3 times before finally signing it. That reveal came through a private recorded conversation, later preserved in a confidential palace account. A written record used to keep track of sensitive royal discussions. The king had not rushed toward this decision. He had circled it, resisted it, and returned to it because every delay made the future less clear for William and Catherine. William heard the pain behind the confession and chose honesty over comfort. The prince told Charles he had never wanted Camilla humiliated. He had wanted boundaries, clear ones. The crown, meaning the monarchy and its future authority, could not survive if the next reign began with rival centers of influence. That mattered because the public might forgive family sadness. But the institution could not afford confusion around who was leading it next. Charles looked at William for a long moment, and both men understood the cruel truth. Camilla had not been erased, but she had been moved aside from the machinery that shaped tomorrow. The king needed his son to understand that this was not revenge. William needed his father to understand that mercy without structure would only delay another crisis. Between them sat the future of the monarchy, heavy and unavoidable. William promised that Camilla would not be treated as if her years beside Charles meant nothing. The prince said she would keep dignity, visibility, and respect. But he also refused to let the monarchy return to the old confusion. Catherine's role had to be protected. His children's path had to be protected. The next chapter had to be clean enough for the country to trust it. Charles accepted that with quiet pain. The king knew William was right, and that made the decision hurt even more. A father had asked his son to understand the damage. A future king had answered by accepting the burden. And in that private exchange, the conflict shifted. It was no longer Charles alone against the consequences. William now understood the sacrifice behind the signature, and when Charles and William finally stood aligned, the palace began preparing for the outside world to learn what had changed. The private wound was about to become a public story, and when the story reached beyond palace walls, the public saw not just a royal adjustment, but the emotional end of an era. By the time the first headlines appeared, the palace had already lost control of the mood. The story was no longer just about duties or schedules. It became a national symbol. Camilla, once fought for, now quietly moved aside. Some saw justice, some saw cruelty, others saw a king choosing stability over love. But one image captured the public feeling more powerfully than any official statement could. Camilla watched the first broadcast in silence, and every sentence seemed to make her smaller. The palace had released a carefully worded update, saying she would focus on a narrower set of ceremonial duties. Ceremonial duties are public royal roles linked to tradition, charity, and national service, but they do not carry the same private power as planning or family leadership. That mattered because the statement did not say she had been pushed aside. It simply made her reduced future sound calm, polite, and already accepted. Charles sat nearby without speaking, and his silence carried its own punishment. The king knew the public would hear only the clean version. They would not hear how long he delayed the order. They would not hear how Camilla asked whether the monarchy had won over their marriage. They would not hear the pause before his answer. The palace update protected the institution, but it left the human pain trapped behind closed doors. Broadcasters moved quickly. One evening program framed the decision as Charles reshaping the monarchy around William and Catherine's future. The presenter called it a quiet transfer of emotional gravity, a phrase that made the change sound almost gentle. But Camilla did not feel gentleness. She heard her life reduced to one palace adjustment, one neat sentence, one smooth explanation for a wound that still felt raw. William saw the coverage from a separate room and understood the danger of public simplicity. The prince knew people would assume he had won. He knew some would say Catherine had replaced Camilla, as if this were a rivalry instead of a painful restructuring. Catherine understood that too. The princess remained composed, but she knew public approval could still feel cruel when it came at someone else's humiliation. Camilla's face tightened when a London newspaper front page appeared on screen. It showed her beside the headline, "The Crown chooses tomorrow." That single line captured everything the palace had tried to soften. The crown, meaning the monarchy and its future authority, had chosen what came next, and the public understood who had been left behind. Camilla looked away before the presenter finished reading it. Charles did not move. The king carried the pain of knowing that history would turn his private sacrifice into public judgment. Some viewers called him strong, others called him cold, but he knew both words missed the truth. He had not stopped loving Camilla. He had stopped allowing her influence to shape the future beyond its new limits. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered as cameras waited for reaction. One woman told a broadcaster, "This feels like the end of the old argument." Her words traveled fast because they sounded simple, but they carried decades of royal tension. Camilla had once been the argument. Now she had become the ending. Camilla heard that line repeated later, and finally stood. The queen consort did not cry in front of the screen. She did not defend herself. She only understood that the world had already given the moment a meaning. But public reaction could not decide the deepest truth. Only the family's final acceptance could do that. And behind the noise of headlines, cameras, and judgment, the monarchy arrived at its final verdict in silence. In the end, Camilla was not removed from history. She was removed from the center of what came next. That distinction mattered, but it did not make the pain smaller. Charles had chosen the crown's future over the comfort of the woman beside him, and the decision left everyone changed. Camilla lost influence. William gained responsibility. Catherine stepped closer to destiny, and the monarchy turned a page it could never turn back. Camilla accepted the decision in silence, but silence did not mean peace. The queen consort understood now that Charles's order had marked the formal end of her central influence over the royal family's future direction. A formal order is a written royal decision with real authority behind it, not a casual request or temporary adjustment. That mattered because her role had not simply been softened, it had been redrawn. The power she once held in private rooms would no longer reach the next chapter. Charles carried the burden like a wound he could not show. The king had not erased Camilla from royal life, but he had drawn a firm boundary around her place. The monarchy, meaning the royal institution, and the duties that protect its future, still allowed her public dignity, ceremonial presence, and respect. But it no longer allowed her to shape decisions around William, Catherine, or the children who represented tomorrow. Charles knew love could comfort Camilla, but love could not rewrite what the crown now required. William emerged from the crisis changed. The prince had not asked for pain, but responsibility had found him anyway. He now stood with clearer authority, no longer waiting in the shadow of palace uncertainty. Catherine stood beside him with quiet strength, and the princess understood that destiny had moved closer, not through celebration, but through sacrifice. Their rise did not feel like victory. It felt like the heavy beginning of a new order. Camilla looked at the file one last time, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The queen consort had fought many battles to reach the heart of royal life, but this battle was different. There was no public enemy to defeat, no headline to outlast, no argument left to win. Charles had spoken. William had accepted the burden. Catherine had stepped into the future, and Camilla finally understood that the fight was over. Camilla closed the file herself. That small gesture carried more power than any statement could. It signaled acceptance, but not comfort. It showed dignity, but not healing. The queen consort remained royal, but no longer ruling. She remained beside Charles, but no longer at the center of what came next. And that was the cruelest truth of all. She had not been thrown out of the story. She had been moved to the edge of it. Charles watched her close it, and the pain on his face said what his voice no longer could. The king's reign had survived by sacrifice, but sacrifice always leaves someone bleeding quietly. William and Catherine became the clear future axis of the monarchy, and the old uncertainty finally ended. The crown chose tomorrow over yesterday. It chose order over comfort. It chose the next generation over the old wounds that had followed the family for years. There is no next chapter to soften this moment. Only the final truth that the crown moved forward and Camilla was left to grieve the place she could no longer hold. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next. The decision did not arrive with noise. It arrived with silence, sealed papers, and a father's final signature. Prince Harry had fought many battles from outside palace walls, but this one reached the center of his life, his children. When King Charles confirmed the final decision about Archie and Lily's titles, the room around Harry seemed to close in. This was not just royal protocol. This was blood, legacy, and punishment colliding. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry read the confirmation once. Then again, as if the words might change if he forced himself to stare long enough, they did not. Charles had confirmed that Archie and Lily would not be granted active royal title recognition, would not use HR styling, and would remain outside the working royal title structure in official palace practice. HR styling means the formal His Royal Highness or Her Royal Highness form used for senior royals, and the working royal title structure means the official system that connects titles to public duties for the crown. For Harry, that plain sentence felt like a door being shut on his children's names. Charles knew the wound would be deep. The king understood that this was not a small adjustment hidden inside palace language. It was a final ruling, not a temporary pause, and that made it harder, colder, and far more dangerous. He could defend the monarchy. He could explain duty. He could say the crown needed clean lines, but he could not pretend his son would hear those words as anything other than punishment. Harry lowered the page slowly. His face changed before he spoke. Shock gave way to disbelief, and disbelief hardened into something closer to betrayal. Archie and Lily were not standing in that room, yet their names carried the whole weight of the decision. Harry had left royal life to protect his family, but now the palace had reached across the distance and touched the one place he still believed was sacred. A senior aide moved before anyone else did. He lifted a second folder from the table and took it away without explanation. The gesture was small, but Harry noticed it. Charles noticed it too. That second file suggested the title decision was not alone. It belonged to a wider review of royal privileges, the benefits, access, and ceremonial rights connected to royal status. Suddenly, the ruling felt less like one decision, and more like the first visible edge of something larger. Harry realized the most painful truth in silence. The palace had prepared this before the confirmation was delivered. The door had already been locked before he knew he was standing outside it. Charles had signed as king, but Harry felt the blow as a father, and now William, Meghan, and Camilla would all be forced to choose where they stood. But before the palace could defend the decision, the people closest to it had to face the personal damage it would leave behind. Behind the titles were not just rules. There were children's names, a father's pride, a grandfather's burden, in a family already split by years of suspicion. Harry saw Archie and Lily as innocent heirs to a history they never asked for. Charles saw the monarchy as a fragile institution that could not keep bending. Between them stood William, Meghan, and Camilla, each carrying a different fear. Harry placed the papers on the table, but he did not let them go. His hand stayed on the page, stiff and still, as if touching the decision could somehow stop it from becoming permanent. Meghan watched him closely. She knew that look. It was not only anger, it was a father trying to understand why his children had been pulled into a battle they never started. Title recognition meant the palace officially accepting a royal name and style in its working records. And for Harry, that mattered because it shaped how Archie and Lily would one day see their place in the family. Charles carried a different kind of pain. The king believed the crown could no longer allow royal titles to float between two worlds used with royal meaning, but without royal duty, public service, or palace responsibility. The crown meant the monarchy as an institution, not just the person wearing it, and he knew every decision made under that name would outlive his own feelings. He did not want to wound Harry, but he feared that if he bent now, the monarchy would face the same question again and again. Meghan finally reached toward the papers, but Harry's hand did not move. She stopped. That small pause said everything. She understood that this was not only about Archie and Lily being denied something. It was about Harry feeling that the palace had found the softest part of him and pressed hard. Meghan felt the insult too, but she also saw the danger. If Harry answered with fire, the palace would call it proof. If he stayed silent, the decision would harden without resistance. William stood on the other side of the wound. The prince believed the ruling would protect the future line, especially the path ahead for George, Charlotte, and Louis. But he knew the cost. Harry would not see protection, he would see rejection. William had spent years preparing for the crown, yet even he could not ignore the human damage sitting beneath the palace language. Camilla asked the question others avoided. Did this decision also close future ceremonial roles for Archie and Lily? Ceremonial roles meant public family appearances or symbolic duties connected to royal events, and her question changed the weight of the room. If the ruling reached that far, then this was not only about titles, it was about future visibility, future belonging, future memory. A private note attached to the file carried the coldest line. Title clarity must precede succession clarity. Succession meant the order of who comes closer to the throne, and that sentence hinted at a deeper palace strategy. Harry had feared a wall. Now he saw the foundation beneath it, and as the emotional lines were drawn, one question began to haunt the family. Who pushed Charles to make the decision final? The answer leads backward to one private moment that changed the palace's patience into action. Every royal rupture has a moment people later pretend was smaller than it was. In this story, that moment was not a speech, an interview, or a public accusation. It was a private naming ceremony plan at Windsor, where Archie and Lily's future roles were quietly raised. A single conversation turned cold. A single request went too far. And from that day, Charles never looked at the title question the same way again. Harry arrived at the meeting, believing he was protecting his children, before the palace could quietly decide their future without him. The Windsor naming protocol meeting was a private palace discussion about how Archie and Lily's names, titles, and family positions would be recorded for future royal use. Naming protocol simply means the formal way the palace records names, styles, and roles so the family knows what is official and what is not. Harry knew those records mattered because one phrase in a palace file could shape how his children were treated for years. Charles expected a careful conversation. The king thought the meeting would settle language, avoid confusion, and keep the family from another public fight. But Harry wanted more than soft wording. He wanted written assurance that Archie and Lily's titles would be formally protected through Charles's reign and even into William's future rule. That request changed everything. It made the room feel smaller. It made the silence heavier. Harry felt the pressure closing around him. Even then, he believed the palace had already started preparing a version of the future where his children existed as family but not as recognized royal figures. To him, written assurance was not a demand for power. It was a shield. Archie and Liet were too young to defend their own dignity, so Harry tried to do it for them before the family history was written without their names in full. Charles heard something different. The monarch sat still because the request sounded to him like permanent royal status, without permanent royal responsibility. Royal responsibility meant public service, official duty, and loyalty to the institution, not just connection by blood. The king could not separate that from the titles, He could love his grandchildren, but he could not let the crown become something people entered and left whenever it suited them. William learned the details later, through a documented palace summary prepared after the meeting. The prince read it alone, and his anger stayed quiet, which made it more dangerous. Harry had asked for guarantees that would reach into William's future reign, and the future king saw that as a warning. It was no longer only Charles's problem. It was becoming his inheritance. One line in that summary changed the direction of everything. No title shall be treated as automatic where duty has been abandoned. William read it once. Charles read it later. Harry would soon feel the force of it. That sentence did not shout, but it carried the power of a gate closing. Once that sentence reached Charles, the family was no longer debating emotion. They were preparing for confrontation. The confrontation happened away from cameras, away from courtiers, and away from the polished language of palace statements. Harry entered the room believing he could still force a father to hear him. Charles remained seated, the signed file beside him, his face unreadable. No anthem, no balcony, no tradition could soften what came next. It was a father and son separated by a decision neither could undo. Harry did not wait for permission to speak. He asked Charles why Archie and Lily had been placed outside active title recognition, and his voice carried the kind of hurt that turns every word sharp. The active title recognition meant the palace officially accepting and using a royal title in its working system. Not just treating it as a family name. That mattered because the ruling did not only shape how the children were named, it shaped how they would be seen, invited, and remembered inside royal life. Charles listened without moving. The king knew Harry wanted a father's answer, not a monarch's defense. But he could not separate one from the other anymore. Royal duty meant public service carried out on behalf of the crown. And to Charles, titles could not remain untouched after years of distance, criticism, and separation from palace work. He told Harry that royal names carried weight, because they served something larger than personal pride. Harry heard only one thing: his children were being made to pay for his choices. Harry's voice cracked when he said Archie and Lybeat had done nothing wrong. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Charles looked away because he knew it was true. The children had not spoken against the crown. The children had not walked away from the palace. The children had not chosen exile, interviews, or public war. Yet their names now sat at the center of a ruling built from adult pain. Charles set his pen down slowly. The sound was small, but it ended the argument before the words did. Harry saw it. He understood it. The king was not opening a discussion, he was closing one. That gesture carried the weight of a locked gate, and Harry felt the finality of it before Charles even said the decision would stand. Harry then revealed what he knew from a recorded conversation with a former palace aide. He said the decision had been shaped before this meeting, before this confrontation, before any final appeal could be made. The palace had acted as if it was still listening, while the answer had already been prepared in silence. Charles did not deny it. That refusal to deny became its own confession. Charles quietly admitted the ruling had been accelerated after the Windsor naming protocol meeting. The king said that moment changed the whole question, because Harry had asked for protections reaching beyond one reign and into William's future. Harry stood still. The meeting he thought was a shield had become the weapon used against him. Harry left without bowing to the silence. Charles remained behind with the signed file, knowing his son had walked out wounded, not defeated. But the deeper truth waited beyond that room. The king may have signed the ruling, but others had helped build the walls around it. Power in the monarchy rarely announces itself. It moves through careful words, quiet warnings, and decisions prepared before anyone calls them final. William did not shout. He did not need to. As future king, his concern carried weight inside every corridor. For Harry, this made the ruling feel even colder, It was not only a father's decision, it was the future closing ranks against him. William read the final brief alone before meeting Charles, and the prince stopped when Archie and Lebed's names appeared. The final brief was a prepared palace file that gathered the ruling, the reasons behind it, and the risks if the decision was challenged. It mattered because this was not loose family talk anymore. It was written policy. It was the kind of document that turned private pain into official direction. And William knew Harry would see every line as proof that his brother had helped close the door. Charles asked the question softly. Was the ruling too harsh? The king did not ask as a monarch testing policy. He asked as a grandfather who knew the children's names would carry the mark of this decision. William chose his words with care because one wrong sentence could sound cruel, even if the meaning was duty. He told Charles that titles must reflect active connection to the crown, not birth alone. The prince believed royal status could not remain powerful if it was detached from royal service. William felt the cost as soon as he said it. He knew the decision protected the future line, especially the path ahead for George, Charlotte, and Louise. Future line meant the direct family path expected to carry the monarchy forward. And for William, that path had to be clean, stable, and free from confusion. If Archie and Lily received full recognition while living fully outside palace control, the prince feared every future ceremony would become a question. Every invitation a test, every absence a headline. Charles listened, but the king did not look relieved. He looked trapped. William had given him the answer the monarchy needed, not the answer Harry wanted. That was the tragedy. One son was asking for protection through love. The other was warning that love without rules could damage the crown they were all born around. William revealed through a documented account prepared for Charles that advisors had warned about a dual royal identity problem. That meant children could carry public royal meaning while living beyond palace duty, palace discipline, and palace messaging. The prince did not invent the warning, but he accepted its force. Harry would later feel politically isolated because the argument had moved from emotion to structure, and structure rarely bends. A confidential palace chart made the isolation clearer. It showed how the ruling protected the direct working line and reduced future claims around ceremony, access, and title use. Charles saw a solution. William saw protection. Harry would see betrayal, and once William's position became clear, Meghan understood the consequences would not stay behind palace walls. When the news reached Monteto fully, the fallout began not as politics, but as heartbreak inside one family home. The palace expected anger. It expected statements, calls, and pressure. But the first reaction was silence. Meghan stood across from Harry as the reality settled between them. Their children's names had become the battlefield. Harry had faced cameras, lawsuits, exile, and royal rejection. Yet this cut differently. This reached into bedtime stories, school forms, family history, and the painful question of what his children would one day believe about him. Meghan read the summary slowly, and for a moment she said nothing. The summary was the shortened version of the palace ruling, written so the decision could be explained without exposing every private argument behind it. It mattered because this was the language the world would hear first, and language has power. One careful phrase could make the ruling sound calm. One cold sentence could make Harry feel erased all over again. Harry watched Meghan fold the paper once. She did not throw it down. She did not cry out. She simply placed it away from the children's things, as if the page itself carried something too heavy to sit near their ordinary life. Archie and Lily were still too young to understand what had happened, but that made the pain sharper. Harry and Meghan now had to decide how one day they would explain that a grandfather's palace had drawn a line around their names. The palace moved quickly behind the silence. Charles prepared a controlled statement that focused on duty, continuity, and the king's responsibility to protect the monarchy. Duty meant official service done for the crown. Continuity meant keeping the royal system stable from one reign to the next. To Charles, those words sounded necessary. To Harry, they sounded like armor placed over a wound. Meghan asked the question that changed the room. Did the ruling affect future invitations, balcony appearances, and ceremonial recognition? Balcony appearances meant the public moments where royals stand together during major events. And ceremonial recognition meant being included in symbolic family occasions tied to the crown. Harry understood instantly why she asked. If the decision reached that far, then Archie and Lily were not only losing title recognition, they were losing future visibility. Harry felt the old fear return. He had tried to escape the institution to protect his family, yet the institution had still found a way to define his children from a distance. He thought about school forms, introductions, birthdays, and the day Archie or Lily might ask why their cousins stood closer to the palace story than they did. That thought broke something inside him. Harry then learned through a private call with a former palace staff member that internal briefing language had already been updated. The staff member explained that there was no expectation of future title restoration written into the new guidance. Title restoration meant reversing the ruling later and giving the children formal recognition again. The absence of that phrase told Harry the palace did not see this as a delay. It saw it as an ending. Meghan looked at him and understood the danger of that ending. Harry was not only angry now, he was cornered. But just when he felt fully trapped, the emotional direction shifted. The shift did not come from lawyers, aides, or statements. It came from two brothers facing what was left between them. The turning point was not dramatic in the way the palace feared. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no public declaration. It was quieter than that. William and Harry spoke privately without aides, without wives, without the old machinery of royal damage control. For the first time in years, the argument stopped being about titles and became about what both men had lost. William agreed to the conversation because silence had become too dangerous. The prince did not offer a reversal, and Harry knew that before the first word was spoken. A reversal meant cancelling the king's ruling and restoring the position that had just been denied. And that mattered because it would make Charles look weak. After confirming the final decision, William came for another reason. He wanted to stop the wound from becoming permanent hatred. Harry entered expecting judgment. He had heard enough palace language to know when sympathy was being used to cover strategy. But William did not begin with the crown. He began with the children. The prince said Archie and Lit should never have become symbols in an adult war. And Harry looked at him sharply because those words sounded close to regret. Not apology, not yet, but regret. Harry asked the question that cut through every excuse. Would William accept the same decision for George, Charlotte, or Louis? The prince went still. George, Charlotte, and Louis were not just his children. They were the direct future of the monarchy. And that difference had always protected them. Direct future meant the family line expected to carry the throne forward without interruption. Harry knew that. William knew that. And for one painful second, both brothers understood the unfairness hiding inside the system. William admitted the ruling protected the crown. But he did not pretend it protected Harry's heart. The prince said the monarchy had chosen clarity because confusion would create future conflict. But clarity could still feel cruel when children were named inside it. Harry listened, not softened, but quieter. He had expected defense. He had not expected his brother to admit the human cost. William then revealed through a private recorded conversation between the brothers that Charles hesitated before signing. The prince said the king kept Archie and Lily's names separate from the harsher legal language because he refused to let the file sound like a personal rejection. Legal language meant the strict wording used to make a palace decision official. And Charles had softened what he could. even while signing what he believed duty required. Harry absorbed that slowly. His father had denied active royal title recognition, but he had not erased Archie and Lily from family memory. That difference did not heal the wound. It did not change the ruling, but it stopped the pain from becoming a complete deletion. Harry hated the decision. Yet, he understood something new. Charles had acted as king while still struggling as a grandfather. William left the conversation, carrying guilt, and Harry left carrying a grief that was no longer simple anger. The brothers had not repaired the past. They had only touched the truth beneath it. But once the world saw the decision, private pain became public judgment. By morning, the private decision had become a national spectacle. The palace wanted control. But the story moved faster than any statement. It crossed breakfast tables, studio panels, phone screens, and palace gates. Some saw Charles as a king, finally drawing a line. Others saw a grandfather punishing children for their parents' choices, and one image captured the entire emotional storm. Harry saw the coverage before the palace statement had finished moving through every channel. His children's names were no longer inside a family argument. They were printed, spoken, judged, and debated by people who had never met them. Public reaction meant the way ordinary people, broadcasters, and newspapers responded to the ruling. And it mattered because the monarchy survives not only through law, but through belief. If people believed Charles had acted with discipline, the crown looked stronger. If people believed he had acted without mercy, the wound became national. Charles watched a morning broadcast without interrupting it. The king heard one commentator call the decision necessary clarity, then another ask whether a grandfather had allowed the crown to overrule his heart. Palace officials framed the ruling as clarification, not punishment. Clarification meant making the rules plain so there would be no confusion later. But Charles knew plain rules could still hurt. He had protected order, yet the screen made him face the emotional cost. Harry felt the damage deepen as Archie and Lily's names appeared again and again. He had fought royal battles before. But this was different because his children could not answer back. They could not explain themselves. They could not choose whether the world used their names as symbols. Harry realized the decision had taken private family pain and turned it into a public argument his children never asked to join. One London newspaper front page dominated the day. The headline read, "The King's final line placed above a split image of Charles and Harry, with Archie and Lily's names printed beneath a black royal crest." A royal crest means the official symbol connected to monarchy and family identity. And the dark version made the whole story feel like mourning. It was not just a headline, it was a verdict before the palace could speak. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered. Some held signs supporting the king, saying duty had to come first. Others left children's drawings near the gates. Quiet little messages that turned the argument softer and more painful. The palace had expected debate. It had not expected crayons, folded paper, and ordinary families asking whether royal children should carry adult punishment. Charles heard about the drawings later and said nothing at first. The king understood that the public was not only judging policy, they were judging love. Harry understood the same thing from far away, and that made the distance between father and son feel even greater. The public storm forced the palace toward one final emotional message. The ruling could no longer hide behind procedure. It had to explain what the decision truly meant. And when the noise finally settles, the verdict is not about paperwork. It is about what survived and what was lost. In the end, the decision did exactly what final decisions do. It ended arguments, but not pain. Charles protected the monarchy as he believed a king must. Harry protected his children as he believed a father must. Neither man walked away victorious. The titles were settled. The palace line was fixed, and the family truth became impossible to hide. Love remained, but trust had been broken. Charles sat alone after the final statement was released, and the silence around him felt heavier than the document itself. The final statement was the palace's official message, explaining the decision to the public. And it mattered, because it became the version history would remember first. Archie and Lily remained loved as his grandchildren, but they were placed outside active royal title recognition and R use in palace practice. The OCH use meant the formal His Royal Highness or Her Royal Highness style used by senior royals, and its removal in practice drew a line between family blood and public royal function. Harry closed the file for the last time. He did not slam it. He did not shout. He simply pressed the cover shut, as if refusing to give the palace any more power over his breathing. The ruling had settled the titles, but it had not settled the hurt. To Harry, the decision proved something painful and freeing at once. Archie and Lily's worth could not be granted by a palace. It could not be taken away by one either. Charles knew history might call him firm. The king also knew his son might call him unforgiving. That was the burden he had chosen. The monarchy presented the decision as a defining boundary between family identity and royal function. Family identity meant who someone is by blood and love. Royal function meant the official duties, privileges, and public roles connected to serving the crown. Charles believed those two things could no longer be treated as the same. William understood the victory and the loss. The prince saw that the crown had been protected from confusion, future disputes, and divided expectations, but he also understood the cost. Another emotional distance between brothers, another wound added to a family already carrying too many. William did not celebrate the decision. He accepted it, and that acceptance carried its own sadness. Harry looked at Meghan and chose the only answer left to him. He would not beg for palace approval. He would not let Archie and Lily grow up believing their value depended on a title. Meghan understood that choice, and she saw the change in him. The hurt was still there, but it no longer owned the whole room. The hidden truth was simple. The ruling did not destroy the family bond completely. It exposed how fragile that bond had already become. Charles chose duty over softness. Harry chose his children over any remaining hope of palace approval. William chose order even while knowing order could still break hearts. The story ends with no reversal, no rescue, and no unfinished question. Only the hard truth that the crown can define titles, but it cannot define a father's love. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next. Is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now. Queen Camilla had prepared herself for resistance, whispers, and cold palace smiles. But she had not prepared for the silence that followed King Charles's final words. In one private decision, the king changed the rhythm of her royal life. Not her title, not her public image, something far more intimate, her access. And when the order was confirmed, Camilla was left speechless. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles did not raise his voice. He did not soften the blow with promises, memories, or gentle excuses. He simply placed the signed order on the table between them, and the room seemed to shrink around the queen consort. The controlled access protocol of formal palace rule, deciding who may enter private royal rooms, archives, and family-only spaces, was now real. It meant Camilla could no longer move freely through certain inner palace areas without approval, not because her title had changed, because trust had. Camilla stared at the paper as though it had spoken against her. She had walked through those corridors as wife, consort, and partner to the king, believing the palace had finally accepted her place beside him. Now the same walls seemed to answer with a colder message. Her unrestricted access to several private residences, sensitive archive spaces, and family rooms had been reduced. The palace would describe it as order. She understood it as humiliation. Charles watched her hands tighten against the chair arms. He knew what this meant. Inside the monarchy, access was never just about movement. It was about confidence, closeness, and invisible power. A person who could enter the private rooms without question belonged to the deepest circle. A person who had to ask permission stood outside a line. That was why this decision mattered. It did not remove Camilla from public duty, but it quietly changed where power ended for her. Camilla tried to answer. Nothing came. For once, the queen had no polished phrase ready, no sharp reply, no steady smile to cover the wound. The list attached to the order named rooms that now required approval before she could enter, and one line carried more weight than all the rest. A sealed corridor connected to private royal records had been placed under direct control. Charles did not explain why. His silence made the restriction feel even darker. The king finally looked up and his face carried sorrow, not victory. He had confirmed the final decision, and he would not take it back. Camilla rose slowly, still speechless, still burning with questions. As she reached the door, she realized this was not the end of the shock. William was already waiting somewhere beyond that corridor, carrying the burden of what Charles had not yet said. But before the palace could understand the order, it had to understand the people wounded by it. This was never just about doors, keys, or palace corridors. It was about trust. Charles stood between duty and marriage. Camilla stood between pride and humiliation. William stood between loyalty and the future crown. In that tense triangle, every glance carried history. Every pause became a warning, and every private emotion threatened to become a public royal fracture. Charles understood the damage before anyone said it aloud. He knew limiting the Queen's access would strike her in a place no public insult ever could. A queen consort, the wife of a reigning king, standing beside him in official royal life, was not supposed to feel like a guest inside the palace she helped represent. Yet, the king believed the decision had become necessary because certain private family rooms were not just rooms. They held letters, records, memories, and choices that could shape the future of the crown. Camilla felt the wound differently. She did not see a security measure. She saw a message. Charles had made the decision, signed it, and confirmed it without allowing her to shape the story before others heard it. That was what stripped away her dignity, not the lock, not the paper. The feeling that the palace had already judged her before she could defend herself. She had spent years fighting for her place, and now one quiet order made that place feel smaller. Lost William knew his presence would make everything sharper. The prince felt the tension in his chest before he even stepped near the room, because several restricted spaces were tied to future succession planning and sensitive household records. Succession planning simply meant the private work of preparing how royal duties, roles, and authority would pass to the next generation. For William, those rooms were not symbols of control. They were protection. For Camilla, his concern looked like betrayal, wearing a calm face. Catherine's name appeared in one confidential household note, and that single detail changed the temperature of the crisis. The princess had warned Charles about boundaries inside the palace, not with drama, but through a documented account sent after earlier concerns. She believed private family spaces needed clearer protection before emotion turned into a bigger disaster. Sophie also advised caution through a private conversation with the king, telling him the decision had to be handled quietly before pain became public damage. Charles stood alone after the meeting, running one hand over the edge of the table. Camilla's empty chair remained slightly pushed back as if the shock had left a mark behind. William waited nearby, saying little, knowing silence might be safer than defense. But private handling became impossible. Once Camilla demanded to know who had turned Charles against her, and behind that shock was one earlier moment nobody could forget. Every palace crisis has a beginning, but the most dangerous ones rarely announce themselves. They begin with a door left open, a question asked too sharply, a name spoken in the wrong room. For Charles, The breaking point was not a scandal before cameras. It was one private incident at Windsor that convinced him the palace needed rules stronger than affection. Camilla had not expected that evening to become the moment everyone would later whisper about. The Windsor archive room dispute began after a private family ceremony when the palace was already tense and tired. An archive room is a protected space where old letters, records, and private family papers are kept away from public view. That night, aides were preparing legacy papers connected to future royal roles. And those papers mattered because they touched the next shape of power inside the monarchy. Charles noticed the open corridor before anyone explained it. He moved toward the restricted family archive area and found the Queen standing near the doorway. She did not look guilty. She looked wounded. When the king asked why she was there, she lifted her chin and said she had every right to know what was being protected from her. That answer cut deeper than shouting. It told Charles the problem was no longer only about a door. It was about trust breaking under the weight of pride. William arrived, moments later, and the prince saw the change in his father's face. It was not rage, it was colder, disappointment. The future king understood at once that something had shifted beyond repair. He knew those legacy papers were not ordinary household files. They were tied to future duties, private arrangements, and sensitive decisions that could affect the royal family for years. If those spaces no longer felt secure, the crown itself would feel exposed. A senior aide later confirmed the most disturbing detail through a documented internal account. One folder had been moved from its original position. That single change sent panic through the household, because in a royal archive, even a misplaced folder can suggest a breach, a question, or a hidden hand. Camilla denied touching anything. She said nothing had been taken, nothing had been searched, nothing had been disturbed by her. But the silence after her denial became heavier than any accusation. Charles did not argue in front of everyone. He simply asked for the archive key to be returned. Camilla stood at the corridor threshold, stared at him, and placed it into his palm without blinking. The Queen kept her pride, but the king felt the final line forming between them. That incident became the trigger Charles could no longer ignore, pushing him toward the final access decision. But when the old wound was finally named, the confrontation became impossible to avoid. The palace tried to contain the decision with careful words and sealed memos. But Camilla wanted something no document could give her. She wanted a face. She wanted a name. She wanted to know who had convinced Charles that his own wife needed boundaries inside his own palace, and when she entered his private room, the restraint finally cracked. Camilla did not ask for permission to feel betrayed. She requested a private audience. And with Charles after receiving the controlled access protocol in writing, and the Queen made sure no aide could soften the moment with polite language. A private audience simply means a closed meeting with the monarch away from staff and public eyes. This one mattered because it was no longer about palace rules. It was about marriage, loyalty, and the terrible feeling that the king had chosen the institution before the woman beside him. Charles knew what was coming before she spoke. He watched her enter with the paper in her hand, and he understood the pain behind her silence. Camilla asked him directly whether William had pushed him into the decision. The question landed like a blade. The king did not answer at once, and that pause wounded her more deeply than any confession could have done. She saw hesitation, and in that hesitation she saw betrayal. Camilla leaned forward and demanded the truth. Charles told her the decision was his, but the Queen heard duty in his voice where affection used to be. That was what broke the room open. She was not only angry about restricted spaces, she was furious that he had turned a private fear into a formal order. The king tried to explain that family-only rooms, sensitive records, and succession material needed protection, but every word sounded colder than the last. Camilla then demanded the full list of restricted spaces. Charles refused to hand over the complete version. He clear's throat said only what he believed she needed to know. That refusal changed everything. The Queen understood at once that there were rooms, names, and records still being kept from her. The controlled access protocol was no longer just a boundary. It became a secret with royal approval. William entered after being summoned, and the air hardened around him. The prince stopped at the doorway as Camilla turned toward him with cold disbelief. She accused him of building a wall around the king, of whispering fear into his father's ear, of making her look like a threat inside her own home. William did not defend himself immediately. He looked at Charles, then back at her, choosing silence, because one wrong sentence could tear the family further apart. Camilla rose from her chair, so quickly it scraped against the floor. Charles flinched. William remained still for several seconds. Nobody spoke, and in that silence the Queen became certain. The prince knew something she did not. Yet the real power behind the order did not come from anger. It came from control. Royal power does not always move with raised voices. Sometimes it moves through quiet signatures, locked cabinets, careful schedules, and people who know exactly when to speak. Charles may have announced the decision, but the machinery around him made it impossible to reverse. Behind the palace access order stood a deeper question. Who truly protects the crown when trust begins to fail? Charles sat with the final control list in front of him, and the weight of it showed on his face. A control list simply meant the written set of rooms, records, and private spaces that could only be entered under approved conditions. This mattered because the access restriction was not aimed at ordinary palace movement. It covered succession papers, personal correspondence, and family-only rooms where the most sensitive parts of royal life were kept away from pressure, emotion, and influence. Annie understood the pain, but she did not look away from it. The Princess Royal viewed the order as painful but necessary because private boundaries had become too blurred for comfort. She had watched the monarchy survive storms before, and she knew one dangerous truth better than most. A palace can forgive hurt feelings. It cannot survive confusion around trust. Anne believed Charles was not closing doors to punish Camilla. He was closing them because the crown needed clean lines before the next crisis arrived. Sophie felt the human cost in a different way. The trusted confidant had sympathy for Camilla, and she knew the Queen would feel exposed by every quiet change. But Sophie also feared that one emotional reaction could turn a private correction into a royal storm. She warned Charles through a private conversation that the decision had to be steady, calm, and impossible to twist. Camilla had to be protected from public humiliation, but the institution had to be protected from private disorder. Charles looked physically tired as he reviewed the final category. One section required king-only approval, meaning even senior household staff could no longer quietly open certain spaces for Camilla. The king paused there longer than anywhere else. That line proved the order was not symbolic. It had teeth. It also proved how far the situation had gone. Trust had become a system, and affection could no longer override it. William's signature was not on the decision, but his concerns were everywhere inside its structure. The prince had warned that future succession records needed stronger protection, and Charles had listened. The future king did not need to sign the page to shape the outcome. His caution had become part of the wall. Camilla now felt rising around her. Annie watched Charles set down the pen after the final confirmation. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once as if accepting a burden nobody wanted. But everyone feared delaying, and when Camilla learned the system was already active, the fallout began immediately. Once the locks changed, the humiliation became impossible to hide. The decision became real, not in a statement but in a hallway. Camilla approached a familiar door, expecting it to open as it always had. Instead, a staff member lowered his eyes and explained the new protocol. No shouting, no spectacle, just one locked door, one quiet refusal, and a queen consort forced to feel the full weight of Charles's final decision. Camilla had walked that route many times before, and that was what made the moment so cruel. She was not entering some distant office or ceremonial room. She was approaching a private palace corridor connected to family records, a place where letters, personal files, and sensitive household papers were kept. Family records simply means private royal information not meant for public release, including notes, arrangements, and papers tied to personal and future royal matters. That corridor mattered because whoever entered it stood close to the hidden heart of the monarchy. The queen reached for the familiar access point with the quiet confidence of someone who had never expected to be stopped. Then the household officer stepped forward. He did not sound proud. He did not sound powerful. He sounded nervous. He informed Camilla that access now required direct approval from Charles or a designated senior authority. A designated senior authority meant someone officially chosen by the king to approve entry when he was not personally available. The words were simple. The insult felt enormous. Camilla's face hardened as embarrassment turned into anger. She realized the staff already knew that was the wound beneath the rule. People beneath her in rank had learned about the restriction before she had found a way to control the story. The queen consort could face public criticism, cold headlines, even private disapproval, but standing before a closed door while an officer explained her new limits made the decision feel personal, sharp, and impossible to hide. Charles heard about the incident later, and the king closed his eyes before saying a word. He had expected resistance. He had expected pain, but he had not fully imagined the humiliation of the first refusal. The order was meant to protect private rooms, sensitive records, and future planning from confusion. Yet, in practice, it had turned his wife into someone who needed permission. That truth struck him hard. The officer had been instructed not to make exceptions, and that detail proved the order was fully active. It was not symbolic. It was not a warning. A second notice then revealed something even more painful. Camilla's personal office schedule would also be reviewed for palace movement approvals. The queen understood immediately. The system was not watching one door. It was watching her movements. Camilla stood before the locked door, her gloved hand hovering near the handle, while the officer whispered the words she never expected to hear. Permission is now required. She turned away without answering, but silence did not mean surrender. The queen's next move would not be quiet, and William knew the family had reached a turning point. But the moment that changed everything came only when the palace voices finally disappeared. After the anger, after the protocol, after the locked door, there came a quieter and more dangerous moment. Charles and Camilla faced each other without aides, without William, without the shield of royal language. For the first time, the decision was no longer about access. It was about whether trust could survive. After one person had been told unmistakably that certain doors were no longer hers, Charles asked for one final private conversation, because he had learned how deeply the first refusal had cut her. He knew the locked door had done what no formal letter could do. It made the decision real in front of staff. It made the queen feel watched, measured, and reduced. Courtiers are palace staff who manage royal schedules, rooms, and official movement. But none of them were allowed inside this meeting. That mattered because Charles could no longer hide behind procedure, and Camilla could no longer aim her anger at the system, instead of the man who signed it. Camilla did not soften her words. She told Charles the palace now looked at her as if she were a risk instead of his wife. The queen said the humiliation was not only in being stopped, but in knowing others had been prepared to stop her. She had stood beside the king through public storms, cold judgment, and years of whispers. Now she felt the wound had come from inside the home she had fought so hard to enter. Charles listened without interrupting, and that silence hurt them both. The king admitted the decision had wounded him too. But he told Camilla the crown could not run on comfort when boundaries had already been broken. The crown in plain terms meant the monarchy itself, the duty, office, and future of royal power beyond one person's feelings. Charles made it clear that affection could not decide who entered sensitive spaces. Not anymore. Camilla searched his face for hesitation. She wanted one crack, one sign that pain might make him reverse the order. But the king revealed the truth in a low, controlled voice. The restriction was not meant to erase her role. It was meant to separate personal loyalty from institutional access. He could love her, trust her in public duty, and still limit her movement where private records and future planning were concerned. Charles removed his glasses and placed them beside the signed protocol. Camilla looked at the paper, then at him, and whispered that she finally understood he had already chosen. The queen did not shout this time. She did not reach for the document. She simply absorbed the final shape of the decision. Her silence marked the turning point. Camilla stopped fighting the order and began facing what it meant. By morning, the palace could no longer keep the wound behind its walls. The monarchy can survive private tension. It can survive whispers, but it cannot easily survive a symbol the public understands instantly. One locked door became a national conversation. One restricted corridor became a headline. And by sunrise, the story of Camilla's reduced palace access had moved from private corridors to breakfast tables, broadcast desks, and crowds outside royal gates. Camilla knew the palace would try to make the decision sound calm. The official confirmation used careful words about updated access protocols, meaning new rules about who could enter private royal spaces and under what approval. But the public did not hear calm. They heard distance. They heard Charles drawing a firm line between marriage and monarchy. That mattered because the Queen's position had always depended on more than ceremony. It depended on the belief that she stood inside the King's closest circle. Charles understood the damage the moment the story reached broadcast desks. The King had wanted order, not spectacle. He had wanted protection, not public judgment. But the language of palace control became the language of power, and broadcasters framed the decision as one of the strongest boundaries he had ever placed around royal life. The monarchy was no longer discussing rooms. It was discussing trust in front of the nation. Camilla paused before the television as a broadcaster described her as a queen consort facing the hardest boundary of her royal life. A queen consort means the wife of a reigning king holding royal status beside him, but not ruling in her own right. She turned the volume down without saying a word. The decision had hurt her in private, but the coverage made the wound public. Now strangers were weighing her dignity like it belonged to them. William remained composed, but Catherine heard the strain in his voice. The prince said the family had to endure the noise. Yet the princess knew endurance came with a cost. He had supported stronger boundaries to protect the future crown. But he did not enjoy watching pain turn into a national argument. Catherine understood why the order mattered. Because family records and succession planning had to stay secure. Still, she saw how easily protection could look like punishment. One newspaper front page captured the mood with brutal force. It showed Buckingham Palace gates under the headline, "The door closes on Camilla's inner palace power." The image spread quickly, and by afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside Clarence's house. Some defended Camilla, saying she deserved respect. Others, Charles had finally protected the monarchy from blurred private influence. Camilla saw the headline later and stayed still for a long moment. Charles saw it too, and the king knew the decision had become bigger than either of them. Public reaction forced the family to accept that the order was no longer administrative. It had become a verdict. But the final meaning of this moment would not be decided by headlines. It would be decided by what Charles refused to undo. In the end, Charles did not raise his voice. William did not claim victory. Camilla did not stage a final rebellion. The palace simply adjusted to a new truth. Some doors would remain closed. Some privileges would no longer return. And beneath the pain of that decision, the monarchy delivered its coldest lesson. Love may stand beside the crown, but it cannot stand above it. Charles allowed the controlled access protocol to remain in place, and that single choice confirmed everything. This was not a temporary emotional reaction. It was not a warning meant to frighten the Queen into obedience. The controlled access protocol, the palace rule, deciding which private rooms, records, and family-only spaces required approval, had become permanent. It mattered because Camilla kept her public position, her title, and her place beside the king. But her private movement through the inner palace world had been changed forever. Camilla accepted the reality with visible restraint. She understood that fighting further would not reopen the doors. It would only deepen the wound and make her look weaker in front of the very institution she had spent years trying to master. The queen consort remained part of royal life, but not with the same freedom. Her era of unquestioned access had ended quietly, and that quiet ending carried more force than any public punishment ever could. Charles carried the sadness of the choice, but he also carried certainty. The king knew protecting the crown required boundaries, even inside his own marriage. The crown, in plain words, meant the monarchy itself, the duty, future, and authority that must survive beyond private emotion. He had not abandoned Camilla. He had simply refused to let love become a key to every locked space. That was the painful line he chose to defend. William's influence became clearer without being spoken aloud. The prince did not need to celebrate, because this was not a victory over the queen. It was a warning about the future. The future king had helped shape a palace where access would no longer depend on personal entitlement, old habits, or emotional pressure. Catherine's quiet role also mattered. The princess had pushed for order, privacy, and family protection, and those concerns became part of the new royal balance. Charles looked across the table at Camilla during the final private breakfast after the decision settled. His eyes carried sorrow rather than anger. She did not challenge him. She did not demand another explanation. The queen simply folded her napkin, stood slowly, and left with dignity. The silence was not defeat. It was acceptance. The story ends with a painful but complete truth. Camilla was not removed, erased, or destroyed. She was contained. Charles chose institution over comfort. William helped secure a boundary for the crown he would one day inherit. Catherine's quiet caution became part of the palace's future discipline. And the monarchy, bruised but steadier, chose survival over sentiment. This was the day the palace stopped pretending every royal door belonged to everyone, and Charles made sure the most important ones would stay protected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next. The palace had survived. Scandals, whispers, betrayals, and wars of bloodline loyalty. But nothing prepared Queen Camilla for the private confirmation that would strip away the one symbol she believed had sealed her place forever. In one quiet meeting, King Charles made a final decision about her coronation role. And the woman who once stood beside him as queen consort suddenly found herself facing a devastating truth. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move when Charles began to speak. She sat in the private sitting room with her hand pressed against the armrest, listening as the king explained that her ceremonial coronation authority would be formally limited in future royal records. That meant the duties and symbolic powers linked to her place during the coronation era would no longer be carried forward in the same way. The coronation role, in plain words, was the part she played during the sacred crowning ceremony and the honor attached to that moment afterward. For Camilla, it had never been only ceremony. It had been proof that the long road of judgment, rejection, patience, and loyalty had finally led somewhere permanent. Charles kept his voice controlled, but control did not make the words gentle. He told her the decision was about protocol, legacy, and how the monarchy would remember the transition from Queen Elizabeth's reign to his own. Protocol meant the palace rules and traditions that decide who stands where, who speaks when, and who carries which duty. Legacy meant the story left behind for history. Camilla heard those words, but beneath them, she heard something sharper. The crown was saying she had been honored, but not fully trusted with the lasting shape of the reign. The queen consort looked at him once, and the silence between them became colder than any argument. Charles looked torn between affection and duty, yet his decision left no room for reversal. He had already seen the sealed palace memorandum. The private written order that confirmed this adjustment was not symbolic alone. A memorandum, simply put, is an official internal note used to record serious decisions before they become public language. This one changed how Camilla's role would be described in future ceremonial planning. It proved the matter had moved past emotion. Aides were already being instructed to prepare revised wording for royal files, future services, and internal records. Camilla finally lowered her eyes, and Charles understood then that anger would have been easier to face. Anger could be answered. Silence could not. She did not accuse him, did not plead, did not ask who had pushed him toward it. She simply sat with the knowledge that the coronation had crowned her in public, while the palace now narrowed her in private. And as the meeting ended, Charles realized the wound would not stay behind that closed door for long. This was not only a decision about ceremony, it was a decision about memory, status, and the fragile architecture of royal acceptance. For Charles, it was a sacrifice made in the name of monarchy. For Camilla, it felt like a final judgment. And for William, Catherine, and Anne, the moment exposed a painful question the palace had avoided for years. Who truly carries the future? Charles felt the weight of it before anyone else dared to speak. The king knew one private decision could become part of the monarchy's permanent story. Not because people heard every word, but because palaces remember everything. Every file, every pause, every changed line becomes history one day. Camilla understood that too, and that was why the wound cut so deep. The coronation had not been just a ceremony to her. A coronation means the formal crowning of a monarch, and the people placed beside that monarch in sacred public duty. For the queen consort, that moment had marked her long climb from outsider to crowned companion. Camilla looked at Charles and asked the question he feared most. Had her loyalty never been enough? The king opened his mouth, then stopped because any answer sounded cruel. If he said yes, he betrayed the decision. If he said no, he betrayed her pain. She had stood beside him through storms that would have broken weaker people. Yet now the crown seemed to be measuring her place with cold hands. Charles tried to explain that the monarchy had to protect its future shape, but she heard only the distance inside his voice. William saw the damage before anyone said it aloud. The prince waited in the corridor as Camilla left the room without speaking, and he knew at once that something irreversible had happened. His father's face carried the strain of a man who had chosen duty over comfort. The future king understood the danger too. If the bond between Charles and the queen consort cracked, the whole household could feel it. Not because marriage was policy, but because emotion at the center of power always spreads outward. Catherine received her briefing separately, and she listened with quiet care. The princess understood that the revision could strengthen the future line by making the next chapter clearer. But she also knew clarity could still hurt someone. Annie sensed the same truth with sharper force. The Princess Royal believed the move was bigger than Camilla herself. It was about stopping blurred authority before it confused the crown's path. One name kept returning in private conversations. Not as an accusation, not yet. But as each person absorbed the decision, the question became impossible to ignore. Who first challenged Camilla's expanded coronation symbolism? The deeper everyone looked, the more one forgotten royal moment began to look like the spark that lit the fire. Every palace crisis has a beginning, but this one did not begin with shouting. It began with a ceremony, a pause, and one glance that senior courtiers never forgot. Months before Charles confirmed the final decision, a single moment during a private coronation anniversary service caused unease inside the royal household. And later, everyone would look back and call it the point of no return. William noticed the change before the first words were spoken. The prince looked down at the altered order of service, and his expression tightened in a way Catherine understood instantly. An order of service means the printed plan of who speaks, who reads, and what happens during a royal ceremony. This service was private, held inside St. George's Chapel for senior family members and palace officials, but private did not mean harmless. In the royal world, even a quiet reading can carry power, because every roll tells the room who belongs closest to history. Camilla had been given a ceremonial reading that many expected would go to a direct representative of the future line. A ceremonial reading means a formal passage spoken during a service, often chosen to reflect duty, faith, and royal meaning. The Queen Consort believed it was a sign of trust after years beside Charles. But William saw something else. He saw a symbol moving too far from the line of succession. Catherine placed her hand over his, not to silence him but to steady him. The princess knew his reaction mattered. If he challenged the moment too openly, it would wound Camilla. If he ignored it, the future could look weak. Camilla saw the movement between them. She saw William stiffen, saw Catherine calm him, and the hurt rose in her before she could stop it. The monarch's wife had endured judgment for years, and this small reaction felt like the old doubts returning in polished royal language. Charles sensed the tension too, but he let the service continue. The king chose stillness, because interruption would have turned unease into scandal. Yet his silence did not erase what everyone had seen. Annie understood the danger with brutal clarity. After the service, the Princess Royal closed the booklet, looked at Charles and said, "This cannot become the pattern." Her warning was later remembered in a documented private account, prepared for senior household officials. She did not speak out of cruelty toward Camilla. She spoke because the moment had created confusion about where symbolic authority ended and dynastic authority began. That moment became known behind closed doors as the St. George Chapel reading incident. It sounded small to outsiders, but inside the palace it carried the weight of a fracture. Camilla thought the day had merely exposed old suspicion. Charles knew it had planted something more dangerous. And that sentence did not explode in the chapel, but it followed him into every room until confrontation became impossible to avoid. When Camilla finally confronted Charles, there were no courtiers to soften the words, no private secretaries to arrange the truth into polite language, and no protocol experts to hide behind tradition. There was only a husband, a king, and a woman who believed the crown had accepted her at last. Then Charles set the file down, and the room changed forever. Charles invited her in without ceremony, and that alone told Camilla how serious it had become. The king did not ask aides to remain. He did not let officials sit nearby with careful notes and polished phrases. A constitutional matter means an issue tied to the rules and future order of the monarchy. Not just personal feeling, but this was also personal. It touched her place beside him, her years of loyalty, and the fragile peace she thought the coronation had finally given her. Camilla looked at the file and knew before opening it that the wound was already written. The file carried the final wording, confirming her reduced ceremonial coronation authority in future palace records. Ceremonial authority means the symbolic duties and honors connected to a royal role, especially during services, anniversaries, and official moments. The Queen Consort asked whether the monarchy was rewriting her place. Charles held himself still and said the crown had to protect the future even when the present suffered. The words were calm, the damage was not. Camilla did not explode, she did something worse. She broke quietly, her voice lowered, her face tightened, and the sadness in her eyes made Charles look away. The king could face anger. He could defend policy, but he could not easily face the pain of the woman who had stood beside him through years of public judgment. She asked him if all the waiting, all the loyalty, all the humiliation had only earned her a temporary place in history. He struggled to answer because the truth had edges. Charles finally revealed what she feared most. The decision had not been forced by one person. It had become unavoidable after repeated concerns from senior family members. Concerns recorded in a private briefing note, prepared for the monarch after the chapel incident. William had understood the direction. Catherine had been briefed. Annie had warned him plainly. Camilla heard those names and felt the betrayal deepen, not because they hated her, but because they had seen the decision coming before she did. Camilla pushed the file back across the table without reading the final page. Some decisions do not need signatures to leave scars, she told him. Charles said nothing. The room held its breath around them. Then the queen consort made one final request, a request that could either protect her dignity or expose the rupture to the entire household. And behind that painful exchange stood a larger force, one even Charles could not ignore. The monarchy does not move only through emotion. It moves through rules, precedents, memory, and the invisible weight of those who know how history judges a crown. Charles may have spoken the final words, but the decision carried the pressure of the future line, the discipline of royal protocol, and the sharp instincts of those determined to stop confusion before it became crisis. Charles sat alone with the advisory note in front of him, and the silence felt heavier than any argument. The king understood that this was no longer only about Camilla's feelings or his own guilt. It was about separating personal loyalty from constitutional symbolism. Constitutional symbolism means the public meaning attached to royal roles, the kind that tells people who represents the future of the monarchy and who stands beside it in support. Camilla had earned respect beside him, but the crown could not allow respect to become unclear authority. Charles read the note again, and exhaustion settled over him. Senior advisors had argued that Camilla's coronation role must be honored historically, but not expanded into continuing power. Continuing authority meant influence in future ceremonies, records, and royal planning. After the original coronation moment had passed, the king knew why that mattered. If the palace allowed one role to stretch too far, every future duty could become a battlefield. Yet protecting the crown meant hurting the woman beside him, and that truth struck him harder than any line on the page. William chose his words carefully in the private briefing. The prince did not want Camilla humiliated, and he made that clear more than once. But he also insisted that respect for the queen consort could not blur the future monarchy. The future king knew the public looked to him and Catherine for what came next. If the royal structure became confused now, his own reign could inherit the damage later. His concern was not personal revenge. It was control before uncertainty became tradition. Anne's earlier warning gave the review its sharpest edge. The Princess Royal had already told Charles through a documented private account, prepared after the chapel service, that the pattern could not continue. Her words carried force, because she had spent a lifetime understanding how small royal gestures become permanent expectations. Catherine's role was quieter, but just as important. The princess supported clarity, yet urged that Camilla not be publicly stripped of dignity. She knew strength without mercy could look like cruelty. Charles lifted the fountain pen, then stopped above the approval line. For a moment, the king seemed to carry both his wife's pain and the monarchy's future in one hand. Then he placed the pen down, waited, and signed minutes later in silence. One revised phrase in the draft would soon start the first wave of fallout. And once that approval was given, The decision stopped being a private wound and began moving through the palace like a cold draft under a locked door. The fallout did not arrive as a public announcement. It arrived in changed schedules, careful pauses, and faces that looked away too quickly. Camilla did not need a press release to understand what had happened. She saw it in the revised briefing notes, heard it in the softened language, and felt it in the sudden distance of a household, trying to pretend nothing had shifted. Camilla read the revised page twice, and the color seemed to leave her face. The queen consort folded the paper carefully, then placed it on the table, as though touching it any longer would make the truth more painful. The palace staff had begun updating internal ceremonial references, replacing expanded language about her coronation role with narrower historical wording. The internal references mean the private notes and planning terms used by royal officials before anything reaches the public. To outsiders, those words may have looked small. Inside the monarchy, they were everything. Charles knew the change had entered the machinery of the crown, and that made it harder to stop. The king understood that future service planning, anniversary references, and royal records would now frame Camilla's place differently beside his reign. Service planning means the official preparation for royal ceremonies, prayers, readings, seating, and duties. Anniversary references are the words used when the palace marks past royal events. These details mattered because history often remembers the language before it remembers the feeling. If the wording changed, the memory changed with it. Camilla saw the removed phrase before anyone explained it. Continuing ceremonial authority had disappeared from the draft, and a senior courtier noticed it too. Ceremonial authority meant the lasting symbolic power attached to her role after the coronation moment itself. Its removal confirmed what the queen consort already feared. This was not just softer language. This was a real reduction. She had not been loudly stripped of honor. She had been quietly narrowed, and somehow that felt even colder. Charles tried to reach her before the silence became permanent. The monarch came to her door and asked for a private conversation, but Camilla refused the first attempt. He stood outside the closed door longer than pride allowed, then walked away carrying the cost of his own signature. William was told the changes had begun, and the prince said almost nothing. His silence carried relief, but guilt moved beneath it. The future king wanted clarity for the monarchy, yet he knew clarity had left someone wounded. Camilla's first public absence made the private rupture harder to hide. She unexpectedly withdrew from a small royal appearance, forcing the palace to explain her absence with careful words and calm faces. But careful words could not cover everything. The household felt the shift. Charles felt it most of all. Yet the moment that changed everything was not written in a file. It happened when two people finally faced each other without the crown between them. After days of silence, the palace expected another confrontation. Instead, what came was quieter and more devastating. Camilla agreed to meet Charles privately, not as queen consort and king, but as two people trapped inside a decision. Neither could escape. No aides entered, no notes were taken, and for the first time, the pain beneath the protocol was spoken plainly. Camilla entered the room with the kind of calm that frightened Charles more than anger. The queen consort had refused him once, and he knew this meeting was not a return to peace. It was a test of whether anything tender could survive what the crown had demanded. Institutional pressure means the force of rules, advisors, duties, and history pressing down on personal choices. This time, none of that stood between them. No officials, no carefully shaped phrases, no one to turn pain into policy. Charles spoke first, and his voice carried the tired weight of a man who had rehearsed the truth too many times. The king told Camilla the decision was meant to preserve the monarchy's future, not erase their shared past. The monarchy's future meant the next line of kings, queens, ceremonies, and public trust that would outlive them both. He said the crown could not afford blurred authority because confusion at the top becomes weakness everywhere below. Yet even as he explained it, he knew the words could not fully comfort her. Camilla listened, then finally said what had been sitting inside her since the file was placed before her. She felt as if the crown had accepted her, only to limit her when history became uncomfortable. The coronation had raised her in front of the world, but now the record seemed to be drawing a smaller circle around her name. Charles did not deny the pain. He told her he could not undo the decision, but he would not allow the palace to turn it into humiliation. The king had made the choice. Now he had to carry its mercy too. Camilla asked for one thing. She wanted the official language to still recognize her loyalty during the coronation chapter. The official language means the exact words used in palace records, statements, and ceremonial planning. Words that later become the memory people quote as truth. The queen consort did not ask for power back. She asked not to be reduced to an uncomfortable footnote. Charles agreed. He promised the final wording would protect her dignity, even if it could not restore what had been taken. Charles reached across the table, and Camilla did not take his hand. At first the silence stretched. Then, after a long pause, she let her fingers rest beside his. It was not forgiveness. Not fully, but it was the first softening after days of ice. The private rupture had not healed, yet it had stopped bleeding. And with that fragile understanding in place, the palace was prepared for the outside world to discover what had changed. By morning, the palace could no longer control the shape of the story. What had begun behind closed doors became a national drama about loyalty, legacy, and the limits of royal acceptance. For some, Camilla had been unfairly wounded after years of service. For others, Charles had finally drawn a necessary line. But one public image turned palace tension into national conversation. Camilla watched the coverage in silence, and every careful word felt louder than accusation. The queen consort turned away when her coronation image appeared beside the revised language because the contrast was too painful. A palace briefing means an official note given to journalists or royal commentators to explain planned events and wording. This one was tied to future coronation anniversary planning, which meant the story was no longer trapped inside private rooms. It had touched the public record, and once royal language reaches the outside world, it becomes almost impossible to pull back. Charles heard the morning headlines and looked stricken. The king had made the decision for stability. Yet now he saw the cost playing across every broadcast. Broadcasters framed it as a defining test of his reign and of Camilla's place in royal history. A reign means the period of time a king or queen rules, and every reign needs a clear story if the public is going to trust it. Charles wanted that clarity, but clarity had wounded the person closest to him, and the victory of order suddenly felt painfully cold. Camilla saw the front page before anyone could hide it from her. The headline read, "Camilla's crowned role cut back. Charles chooses legacy over loyalty." Those words landed like a second decision. The queen consort had survived years of judgment, but this was different. This was not old scandal returning. This was the country debating whether her crowned role had always been temporary. She did not speak. She simply looked away, and the silence around her said what no palace statement could soften. Charles listened as a morning presenter held up the paper and said, "This is not a divorce of affection. It is a separation of symbolism." The phrase spread fast because it sounded clean, almost elegant, but the king knew the truth was messier. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered. Some held flowers for Camilla, seeing her as a woman hurt after years of service. Others argued the decision was necessary discipline, a line drawn to protect William, Catherine, and the future monarchy. Camilla understood then that the private wound had become a public lesson. Charles understood it too. The palace prepared one final statement, not to reverse the decision, but to define what it truly meant. The monarchy would not deny the pain. It would not undo the line, And when the final words came, they did not restore what the queen consort had lost. They finally revealed why the crown had chosen this path. In the end, the decision did not destroy Camilla, and it did not free Charles from the pain of making it. It did something more complicated. It showed that the monarchy can honor a person while still limiting a role, that love can exist beside duty, and that the crown always demands a price from those who stand closest to it. Camilla accepted the final wording with a sadness no palace phrase could hide. The queen consort understood that her coronation role would remain part of history, but it would not carry expanded ceremonial authority into the future. Ceremonial authority means the lasting symbolic attached to royal duties, services, records, and public moments after the original ceremony has passed. Her place beside Charles was not erased. Her service was not denied, but the reach she believed had been secured on Coronation Day had been quietly, firmly limited. Charles confirmed the decision stood, and the king felt every inch of its cost. He made sure the final language recognized Camilla's loyalty, her service, and her place beside him during his reign. A reign means the period of time a monarch rules, and for him, that story could not be written without the woman who had stood beside him through years of storm. But the monarchy could not survive if personal emotion overtook constitutional clarity. Constitutional clarity means the rules and public meaning must be easy to understand, so the future line is never confused. William and Catherine emerged from the crisis not with victory, but with restraint. The prince did not celebrate what had happened, because he knew the decision had wounded Camilla deeply. The princess carried the same quiet discipline, understanding that the future monarchy had been strengthened, but not without pain. Their role became clear, through silence, not triumph. They represented the line ahead, the next chapter, the structure that Charles had chosen to protect, even when it hurt the present. Anne's warning proved decisive. The Princess Royal had seen the danger before others wanted to name it, and her private words to Charles became part of the force behind the final review. The old guard had acted not out of cruelty, but out of loyalty to the crown itself. Sentiment had come close to stretching structure too far. Anne knew that once a royal symbol becomes expectation, it is almost impossible to take back without pain. This time the pain came anyway. Camilla later stood beside Charles at a private reception, composed but changed. The king gently adjusted his cuff and kept his gaze forward, while the queen consort held herself with dignity that looked almost like armor. Both of them knew the old certainty between them had ended. She had not been rejected as a woman. She had been redefined as a royal figure. He had not abandoned his wife. He had chosen the institution's future over the comfort of the present. The final truth was brutal but clear. Camilla kept her place beside Charles, but not the full symbolic reach she believed the coronation had secured. The king kept her dignity intact, but placed the crown above her pain. The monarchy survived, colder, clearer, and stronger, by drawing a line through the heart of its most complicated partnership. This was not the end of a marriage or the fall of a queen. It was the moment the crown reminded everyone that no personal victory is ever larger than the throne itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.